G'day all. I'm going to admit something first up, which is that I adapted this PowerPoint presentation that I'm just about to talk to you about from one that said criteria for evaluating interactive simulations, and literally just did a find and replace and then went through and fixed up and tidied up and made sure the grammar all hung together and so on. Because really, interactive simulations are one kind of educational resource, but there are many others. So some of these points will be more applicable to computer-based resources versus things like textbooks or other physical resources that you find, model kits in chemistry, various other things like that. But a lot of the criteria are still relevant, and where the thing is not computer-based, you will apply that affordance to other things. So that's the kind of a disclaimer. But so first one, and probably the most important, if you are going to use a resource in your class of any kind, is it scientifically accurate, or is it just plain wrong? Is it going to reinforce misconceptions? Does it represent our best current understanding, or an earlier model if you want that? So for example, in atomic models, again, you might want to use Bohr's model of the atom because you're working with a class for which that's appropriate and so on. But is it accurate for the purpose of what you're trying to do? Does it avoid reinforcing common misconceptions? Here's an example. Videos or simulations with water molecules moving around. So your hydrogen and your two oxygen and your two hydrogens, sorry, moving around. There's a bunch of them. And quite often producers will put a flowing water sound behind that because it's water and it's moving. But that suggests to the student that the water molecules are moving through a liquid, which they're not. They are the liquid, and their interactions form the liquid. So putting that sound behind, although it might seem kind of intuitively right, is actually reinforcing misconception, the notion that water molecules are dissolved in some other liquid to form the actual water. Does that make sense? So that kind of thing, does it reinforce misconceptions? Are you simulating or representing something that's already visible to the students? And in which case, why are you using a simulation rather than the real thing? Or is it something that's invisible or that takes a very long time? So geological processes, you could actually watch it, but it takes 10 million years to happen, so we'll do a simulation that speeds it up, and so on. So what is the thing? Is it a thing at all, or is it something like field lines, which are really a concept rather than a thing? And so on. So be thinking about what are you representing, and is it the best possible representation? But is it accurate? Is it scientifically correct? And what evidence do students have for that? What warrants do they have to know that this is not just a Roadrunner cartoon in which people run off the edge of a cliff and don't fall until they notice that they've run off the edge of the cliff, right? That's a simulation of reality, but it's not scientifically accurate. So what warrants do students have, what evidence do students have to help them understand that this simulation of reality, in whatever form, that can be a diagram in a textbook, is simulating reality, not something non-real system, if that makes sense. Learning objects. So if you have a particular resource, so that's a good example. The learning by doing materials for junior secondary science, they're from the Australian Academy of Science. They have books for students, but they also have books for teachers, and they have professional learning experiences for teachers that you can go for a couple of days or a weekend and learn about how to use the learning by doing materials. There's a bunch of resources around the resource, if that makes sense. So there's no good or bad in this. If the resource is just the thing unto itself and you create the infrastructure around it, that's fine if that's what you prefer to do. But sometimes it can be really nice if there's a whole bunch of professionally prepared lesson plans, quizzes, other resources around the resource you decide to choose. So think about, what are the affordances, what are the extras, what are the bonuses that help make my life easier as planning to teach if I choose this resource over that resource, or if I choose this resource over nothing, if that makes sense. How interactive is it? So I've looked at a lot of computer-based simulations and visualizations over the years. Some of them are incredibly interactive and are basically a virtual lab where you can tweak pretty much anything and see the effects. Some of them are basically a video where you have to just hit forward every now and then, or just a straight video, or like there's no interaction. They're just student sits back and passively receives. And we know, our learning theories tell us that when the students actively engage, they're much more likely to retain it than if they just simply passively absorb. So how interactive is it? Is it appropriate for the purpose? Bottom line there, how do students get out of it? How do they escape? So if quite a lot of online interactive tools, or, you know, I'm going all the way back to when the dinosaurs roamed the earth and we used HyperCard on the Mac, which was very, very early sort of hypertext and hypermedia software. And students would kind of get caught in a loop, and there was no way to know that they'd finished the activity and move on to something outside the computer. How do they stop using the computer rather than just the end of period bell going? So how do you use the resource but keep some forward momentum in the lesson so that it's not just aimless faffing about on the computer with the resource? So those kind of things. And how was it designed? Was it designed to be a demonstration for the whole class, or kind of an interactive demonstration, so you can put it on an interactive whiteboard, have students come up and interact with it and so on? Or does it need to be one student per computer, so each individual is doing it? Maybe if you're using it for an assessment purpose or something like that, or small groups, because there's quite a lot of research that shows that 3 people to a computer is actually much better than 1 person to a computer, because the humans interact with each other in ways the computer's not smart enough to do, and explain things to each other and challenge each other with questions and so on. So think about how students are to interact with the resource in the way that's most educationally valid and viable and going to be the most effective. The learning curve, we're here to teach science. We're not really here to teach how to use a particular resource. And if the learning curve for the resource is so huge, if it takes you 3 periods to learn to use the tool, and then you only get 1 period worth of content out of it, you've wasted 3 periods when you could have been teaching content. So, but if it takes you 3 periods to learn the tool, and then you use it throughout the year for 20 hours of content, then it's probably worthwhile. So what's the cost benefit? How long is it going to take them to learn to use it? And how long is it going to take for the tech just to wake up and get happening? I visited some school classrooms in Townsville at one point, and the kids were using laptops, but the Wi-Fi was very slow, the laptops were very old and slow, the students had to log into a school network, but the Wi-Fi didn't work very well, and the passwords tended to fade and get forgotten, and it literally took half an hour of a 50-minute lesson before most of the kids were actually logged in and ready to learn. So basically you've used 60% of your available learning time just to get in. That's not even the learning curve of how to use the tech. That's just to get the tech open. So, you know, figuring out those costs and benefits. Tech obviously has interesting possibilities to offer, interesting affordances that text and books and so on don't have, that whiteboards don't have. But what are the costs that associate with that? And as I say, that principle of if you can have a learning curve once, but then learning multiple times, it's far better than the learning curve once, learning once, and then move on to the next thing, if that makes sense. So maybe choose one really good, powerful, big, versatile tool that you'll use all year, rather than a whole bunch of sort of piecemeal little bits and pieces across the year as well. How aesthetically pleasing is it? Now, I'm not 100% sure about my choice of background today with the slide color scheme with my t-shirt, how aesthetically pleasing versus jarring that is. And of course, aesthetic attractiveness is very much an individual subjective thing. The artworks that I will go to at a gallery and like are quite different from those that my wife or my daughters would go to. Different people have different tastes, but you know, is it not hideous? Does it avoid at least having clashing very close but not quite the same colors, or your patterns, or all of those kind of things? So how good does it look? Now, you know, again, I'm real old, so you know, it used to be that just the fact that it was on the computer was cool and new and novel, and you know, the comparison for students was with a static book page. So the fact that it was moving and the fact that it had colors and so on was exciting. But now they're playing, what's the very latest very dramaticist, amazing looking game. I don't even know. I'm still playing Skyrim from 5 years ago, whatever it is, 8 years ago. You know, they are playing Skyrim, the new HD version, whatever. They're playing the latest Call of War Duty, whatever it is. So, you know, they have these incredible visual experiences. They are watching the superhero movies with lots of CGI in them. They are watching the live action Disney movies likewise, and so on. So the computer is not a cool thing anymore in itself. You can't just use that as a motivation, because actually most of the scientific software is going to look a lot crapper than most of the entertainment software that you do. So it has to be engaging educationally. It's not going to win them over by style and aesthetic attractiveness, but it shouldn't be hideous. And quite often a lot of the materials, the interactive simulations and so on, are made by people who are great at science, but they don't bring in a designer. Now, I do know some designers, including Rob Simon, who works at NASA and works on the ways that they represent climate data, among other things, and also satellite and other space photos and so on. And he's told me a little bit about there are particular palettes of colors for conveying particular things and if you contravene that, people kind of don't know, they're not conscious of it, but there's a language that they've actually learned from looking at professionally designed materials. And quite often you can send the wrong message by choosing the wrong color for something. So, you know, a lot of the stuff is not particularly well designed. The stuff that's well designed is worth chasing up. And if you're going to build things yourself, calling in an actual designer with actual expertise is probably better than just relying on your own kind of intuitive tastes or whatever. Level of complexity versus simplicity for the students. Is there the ability to add extra challenge for the students who need extra challenge, but to then simplify it for the students who need it simpler, and so on? So again, how is it actually communicating information? So, you know, in general, red is hotter and blue is cooler, and those kind of things. So how do we use those conventions to better communicate information and the scientific content that we're there to learn? Accessibility, students with special needs and other disabilities or whatever. I think I may have talked about this before as well, but can it be zoomed if their vision is not as good? Or change colors for different kinds of color blindness, screen readers, etc., sound, text, etc. So quite a lot do. And in fact, some of the simulations now are really clever. They can be used with text or audio, and you can actually just import a file that has the language for, some of the simulations have 17 different languages or more, that you can actually run the whole simulation in a bunch of languages if you have students who have a different language background. So there is increasing accessibility, and again, well-designed stuff is designed to be modifiable for people with particular needs, but some stuff isn't. So thinking about it's usually your specific class, like it's not usually a matter of saying, is this available to everybody in the universe? It's, okay, I know that Jamil in my class has this particular audio processing difficulty and struggles with audio narration, but is fine with text. Does it have that capacity? It's that kind of thing. It's specific and focused and tailored for your particular students in that class. How obvious is the navigation? And again, there's a language around navigation of web pages and other online resources, and good web pages use it well. Poor web pages make it really confusing. What do I do next? You know, you'll know what it's like. If you found a page, you need to do something, but there's nothing obvious that you can do, and it turns out that you need to scroll down another 3 pages and there's a button right at the bottom, that kind of thing. So is it working with those conventions of communication? Does it have buttons and arrows and things where you expect them to be? Do you close it in the same way, and so on? Now, there's interesting differences across Mac versus Windows platforms about those things, about where to click. And I tend to work across both platforms all the time. My laptop's a Mac, my desktop's Windows. So, and you know, people who are comfortable with that probably are better off to navigate, but your students won't all be. So how well does it actually help? Is there a help icon? I've seen lots of simulations that have or other tools. I do keep talking about simulations, but seen lots of tools where there's a help icon, but all it does is tell you who made it, which is not that helpful. So is the help helpful? Is useful? Is it relatively intuitive, and is it clear? So thinking about how easy it is for the student to get around versus you having to walk around the room all the time giving hints and nudges, or you having to give a half-hour lecture before they start to tell them how to navigate the thing. Will it work on the tech you've got? If it's a tech thing, obviously if it's a book, it will work. They never crash, they're just very, very reliable. But will it run on the computers you've got with the network connection you've got? Very common rookie error. You go and test it in the morning when there's nobody at the school and it runs beautifully because nobody else is on the network. And then you go to class in the middle of the day and everybody's on the network and it's slow as crap and won't even load anything. So, there's lots of ways like that where technical feasibility. Are the computers too old to run it well, or does it need plugins? Things like Java, Flash, QuickTime, etc. So test it. Is there a download? How long is that going to take? Is there stuff to set up? A personal experience was that I was teaching in way up northern Canada, so quite close to the Arctic Circle, hour of daylight during the winter and so on. And we were in very small schools, and so I got the students to download and install, I think it was Java, and it took 7 or 8 hours of downloading to download Java at that time at the speed that they had. So they downloaded it, installed, got it running, and then the next day when it was time to do the lab, Java couldn't be found anywhere on the computer. And it turned out that the school had set up a system that every night just ghosted the computer drives of every computer in the school back to their standard software setup and removed the Java. So those kind of things, quite often there are systems. Actually, classic one in Queensland is that Ed Queensland schools are behind a firewall, a filter that is very, very strict. And even things like YouTube, very commonplace things that you think you might be able to use as resources are just not available at all. Facebook, I don't think is. There's a bunch of stuff that's not available. I think maybe the PhET simulations that I'm going to talk about in a later session today are available now, although I'm not 100% certain, but for a long time they weren't. So that's a real constraint. What does the school firewall keep out? You need to test stuff at school, not at home, because you'll be able to have something that's fantastic and runs well at home and just won't run at all at school, and so on. So I think there's a bunch of stuff around just will it work, and will it work under the conditions that you need to run the class. Finally, this sort of the judgment about does it work for this class, not does it work for chemistry students in general in the world, but what is it about my class, where we're up to, the Queensland syllabus and assessment package, my own strengths and weaknesses as a teacher, any special needs or abilities in the class, a whole bunch of characteristics of this class and this teacher together. A particular resource that's great somewhere else may not be great here, and vice versa. So, and this is why we can't really, it'd be nice in some ways to have a big server that just basically says, all right, this is the best chemistry education resource for stoichiometry in the world, just use this one. But it might be the best in the world for another class, but not for your class, and so on. So this is an important criterion as well. How well does it fit your specific needs? And you're really the only person who can make the judgment about that. And finally, I've mentioned a bunch of criteria here. The quiz might even ask you how many there are. And all of them have different weights. So scientific accuracy is kind of a go, no-go. If it's not scientifically accurate, all the others could be amazing and you still wouldn't use it. But some of the others, so like accessibility, for example, you might be able to find workarounds and so on. So overall, you have to optimize the best possible tool for the job, given all the constraints, and the best possible tool for the job that you can find, because there might be 200 tools for this particular job and you don't have time to evaluate all of those. So you might evaluate 6 or 7 or 3 and find the best of those as well. It has to be manageable for you to actually figure out. But in the end, you'll make a judgment about which tool is the best for your purposes for this particular activity to learn this content for these students in this context. So I hope that's really helpful, and I hope that that's something that you, again, this is probably playing into this theme that I keep talking about, but this is week 11, so it's been a while since you heard me talk about it, but building your repertoire for professional judgment, that you are the professional in the field, in the situation, in the moment, making the decision, and these are tools and skills that you need to make those professional judgments and make them well. Thanks a lot.